Hello there. Welcome back to another story time. If you're not subscribed yet, please click down below and tell me where are you from?
The first thing I noticed when I walked into the country club was the smell of lilies. Too many lilies. Someone had ordered them by the truckload, white and suffocating, arranged in crystal vases on every surface that could hold weight. My brother's wedding. June in Connecticut. The kind of afternoon where the air feels like warm syrup, and even the wealthy look slightly uncomfortable in their own skin. I was 34, standing near the bar in a navy suit I'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse, drinking a bourbon I couldn't afford and pretending I belonged. The suit didn't fit right around the shoulders. Nothing in my life fit right around the shoulders anymore. My stepdad spotted me from across the room. I saw it happen in slow motion. The recognition, the calculation, the decision to approach. Richard. 62, silver hair cut tight to his skull, the kind of tan that comes from Florida golf courses and dermatology appointments. He'd married my mother when I was 12, which meant he'd spent 22 years teaching me exactly where I stood in the world. Not low. Just adjacent, peripheral. The son who hadn't turned out the way he expected, who'd refused the college fund, the business connections, the life blueprint. Marcus, he said, arriving with his hand already extended. The handshake was firm, performative, 2 pumps and release. Didn't expect to see you here. It was my brother's wedding, his stepson's wedding. But Richard had a way of making my presence feel like an intrusion, a logistical error. Wouldn't miss it, I said. He looked past me, scanning the room for more important conversations. Then his eyes dropped to my left hand, to the calluses there, the faint grease stains under the fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. I'd showered for 20 minutes that morning. Still. So, he said, and I heard the tone shift, the setup. Still driving that truck? The question wasn't quiet. Richard didn't do quiet. He projected, the way men who've spent decades in boardrooms project, chest forward, voice carrying, assuming the room is always interested. Around us, conversations paused. The bride's family stood nearby, her father in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her mother in pearls that caught the light like small moons. Freight lines, I said. Regional. Nothing glamorous. Nothing glamorous, Richard repeated, loud enough for the cluster of guests to hear. He laughed, a single sharp note, a punctuation mark. My stepson, the truck driver. 10 years now, right? Since you dropped out of that community college? I felt the heat move up my neck. Not shame. Something harder. Something I'd been swallowing for a decade, letting it calcify in my stomach like a stone I carried everywhere. Something like that, I said. My mother appeared at his elbow, her face a mask of social panic. She'd perfected that look over decades of marriage to Richard. The quick smile, the desperate attempt to redirect, the silent plea for me to not make a scene. Don't embarrass us, Marcus. Don't be difficult. Don't remind people that our family has cracks. Richard, they're seating for dinner, she said, touching his arm. In a minute. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on me, bright with the particular cruelty of a man who'd never been punched in the mouth for the things he said. You know what I don't understand. You had every advantage. My connections, your mother's support. And you chose this. He gestured vaguely at my suit, my hands, my existence. Driving around in a cab all day, sleeping in rest stops. No wife, no house, no real career. What happened to the kid who used to build those little robots in the garage? All that potential just gone. The word potential hung in the air like smoke. I heard someone laugh nearby, a nervous guest not sure if this was a joke or something else. My brother was across the room, trapped in a conversation with the photographer, oblivious. The bride's family had gone still, listening. I opened my mouth to say something. What? I didn't know. The truth was too large for this room, too strange. The lie was too small, too worn out. I'd been telling the lie for 10 years, letting Richard polish it with his contempt, using it as a shield against questions I couldn't answer. Then someone moved. The bride's father. I'd been introduced earlier as Thomas Brennan, pharmaceutical executive, old Connecticut money, the kind of man who collected vintage watches and served on museum boards, stepped away from his wife. He was shorter than Richard, softer in the middle, with gray eyes that didn't match the rest of his polished appearance. He moved deliberately, not fast, crossing the space between us with the patience of a man who'd never been rushed in his life. He stopped beside me, close, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive, and see the small scar above his left eyebrow, white against tanned skin. Richard's smile faltered. Just slightly. He wasn't used to being interrupted during a performance. Thomas, Richard said, recovering, extending his hand. Good to see you. I was just catching up with my... I know who you are, Thomas Brennan said. He didn't take the hand. His gray eyes were on Richard, but his voice dropped to a register meant only for me, a whisper that cut through the room's noise like a blade through silk. 4 words. Son. You saved her. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something, charged and humming, like the air before lightning. Richard's smile didn't vanish gradually. It collapsed, all at once, the way a building falls when someone removes the wrong support beam. His face went gray, not pale, not white, but the color of old concrete, of something dead that hasn't been buried yet. I didn't understand. Not yet. But I felt the words land in my chest like stones dropped in deep water, sending ripples outward through everything I thought I knew. Thomas Brennan didn't look at Richard again. He turned to me, his expression something I couldn't read. Gratitude, maybe, or grief, or a mixture so tightly wound they couldn't be separated. Table 12, he said, loud enough for the room to hear, his hand light on my shoulder. You're sitting with my family tonight, Marcus. I'd like you to meet my daughter properly, the one who talks about you more than she talks about her own fiancé. He walked away. My mother stood frozen, her hand still on Richard's arm, her eyes wide and searching my face for something. Explanation, reassurance, a sign that her carefully constructed world wasn't cracking open. Richard said nothing. For the first time in 22 years, Richard had nothing to say. I looked down at my hands, the calluses, the grease stains, the hands of a man who'd spent 10 years becoming invisible, becoming small enough to fit inside a lie that protected something larger than himself. The lilies smelled like funerals. I set down my bourbon and walked toward table 12, feeling the room's eyes on my back, feeling the weight of 4 words that had just rewritten everything. The dinner was a blur of silverware and murmured conversations, but I sat between Thomas Brennan and his wife, Eleanor, who had the kind of elegance that comes from never having to try. She touched my wrist when she spoke, light as a bird landing, and asked about routes I'd driven, states I'd seen at 3 in the morning through a windshield filmed with road salt and exhaustion. You must know every interstate in the Northeast, she said. Most of them, I said. The ones that matter. She smiled like she understood something I hadn't said. Across the table, her daughter, the bride, Claire, 26 and radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my truck, kept glancing at me with an expression that made my chest tight. Not recognition, exactly. something softer, something that looked like waiting. Thomas Brennan didn't speak to me again during the meal. He didn't need to. His 4 words had done something I couldn't yet measure, shifted tectonic plates beneath a floor I'd thought was solid. But I watched him. I watched the way he cut his steak with precise movements, the way he listened to his wife's stories with his whole body inclined toward her, the way he checked his watch, a vintage Rolex steel and faded gold, with the unconscious habit of a man who measured time carefully because he'd learned that it could run out. After the speeches, after the cake, after my brother had danced with his new wife to a song I'd never heard before, I found myself outside on a terrace that overlooked the club's golf course. The grass was too green, irrigated and perfect, stretching into darkness. The air had cooled enough to feel like relief. Thomas Brennan stood at the railing, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking at nothing. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said, without turning. I stopped a few feet away. "To my brother's wedding?" "To this." He gestured vaguely at the country club, the reception, the world he'd built and inhabited. "I wasn't sure you'd want to be in the same room as Richard. After everything." I felt the stone in my stomach shift. "You know Richard?" "I know what he is." Thomas turned. The terrace lights caught the scar above his eyebrow, made it silver. "I know what he's done, what he's taken from people who couldn't afford to lose anything else." "I don't understand." "No." He took a sip of scotch. "You wouldn't. That's the point, isn't it? That's why you let him think. Why you've let everyone think. For 10 years. The truck driver. The dropout. The disappointment. It was easier than the truth. Easier than explaining why a man with your mind, your education, your capabilities would choose a life that looks like failure from the outside. My hands found the railing. The metal was cool, slightly damp with evening dew. "How do you know what I can do?" "Because I checked." Thomas's voice was quiet, not unkind. "After Claire told me, after she showed me the articles, the patents, the work you've published under a name that isn't yours, I hired someone to find the connection. It took 3 months. You're very good at being invisible, Marcus. Almost as good as you are at engineering. The articles, the patents, the name that wasn't mine. Dr. M. Cole. The papers on autonomous logistics systems published in journals no one in my family read. The patent for the routing algorithm that had been licensed by a company in Seattle for enough money to pay off my mother's mortgage, anonymously, through a lawyer in Delaware, because Richard would have found a way to take it if he'd known. The consulting work? Late nights in truck stops, coding on a laptop while diesel engines idled outside my cab like sleeping beasts. 10 years of becoming 2 people, the visible failure, the invisible success. Because Richard had taught me early that visibility was danger, that anything he could see, he could take, he could diminish, he could use as leverage against my mother, against my brother, against the fragile piece of a family held together by silence and strategic blindness. "I did it to protect myself," I said, "not to be noble." "Protect yourself from what?" "From him." I nodded toward the reception, where Richard was probably dancing with my mother, performing the role of generous patriarch for guests who didn't know the cost of his generosity. From becoming what he wanted me to become, his project. His proof that he could mold people. I watched him do it to my brother. The right school, the right job, the right wife. I watched him try to do it to me. So I disappeared. I became small enough that he lost interest. Small enough that he forgot I was sharp enough to cut him. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The golf course breathed in the darkness, insects and distant sprinklers. "Claire found your work 2 years ago," he said. "She's in supply chain management. She was reading industry journals, Saw your algorithm cited in a paper on port automation. She started digging. She found the patents, the pattern of anonymous donations to engineering scholarships, the consulting contracts with companies that build the infrastructure no one thinks about. She told me, "Dad, this man is brilliant, and he's hiding like he's ashamed of it." She doesn't know why. She knows enough. Thomas set down his glass. She knows that her fiancé's stepfather is a man who built his fortune by taking credit for other people's work, who partnered with an engineer in Hartford 15 years ago, stole his designs, drove him to bankruptcy, and never looked back. She knows that the same man has been systematically dismantling your mother's independence for 2 decades, keeping her dependent, keeping her grateful, keeping her small. She knows that the only way you could survive in that house was to become invisible, and that you chose invisibility over surrender. The stone in my stomach was moving again, heavy and painful. That engineer in Hartford, the one Richard destroyed? Thomas's gray eyes were steady. He was my college roommate, my best friend. He killed himself in 2009 after Richard took everything and left him with debt and a reputation for failure that wasn't his. I've been waiting 15 years for someone to stop Richard, for someone to be sharp enough, patient enough, invisible enough to get close and cut deep. I understood then. Not all of it, but enough. The 4 words at the wedding weren't random. They were an invitation, a recognition. A door opening into a room I'd been building in secret for 10 years, brick by invisible brick. "You want me to?" "I want you to stop hiding," Thomas said. "Not for me. Not for Claire, though she'll tell you her own reasons if you let her. I want you to stop hiding because the man in that room, the one laughing at his stepson, the truck driver, has spent his life making brilliant people feel small. And you're the first one I've found who stayed brilliant anyway, who built something real in the dark and kept it alive." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, thick stock, embossed with a law firm's name in Manhattan. "Richard's partners in the Hartford deal," he said, handing it to me. Names, dates, financial records, communications that were supposed to be deleted. I've been collecting for 15 years. I couldn't use it. Too close to my friend. Too much liability. Too many connections that would burn me before they burned him. "But you," he paused. "You're invisible. You've spent a decade learning how to move through systems without leaving traces. You have the skills to do what I can't, to prove what he did, to make it public in a way that destroys the only thing he cares about." "Which is?" "His reputation." Thomas smiled, and for the first time I saw something cold in his gray eyes, something that had been waiting a long time. "Richard would rather be dead than ordinary. He'd rather be dead than exposed as a thief. You know this. You've always known this. It's why you stayed small, because you understood that the only weapon against a man like Richard is the truth. Delivered precisely, delivered publicly, delivered by someone he never saw coming." I unfolded the paper. The names meant nothing to me yet, but the dates did. 2008, 2009. The years when Richard had been building his empire, when I'd been a teenager watching my mother grow quieter, watching my brother grow harder, learning that survival in that house meant becoming transparent, becoming air, becoming someone who could pass through walls. "You saved her," Thomas said again, and this time I understood who he meant. Not Claire, my mother. The woman who'd chosen Richard because she was afraid of being alone, who'd stayed because she was afraid of being nothing, who'd learned to smile at insults and apologize for my existence because it was easier than imagining a life where she didn't need a man to validate her. I'd stayed invisible to protect her. Because if Richard had known what I was building, what I was capable of, he would have found ways to use it against her. To make her choose. To make her sacrifice one son for the peace of the household. And I couldn't trust her to choose me. I couldn't trust that her fear wouldn't outweigh her love. She doesn't know, I said. Any of it. She knows you're not a truck driver, Marcus. She's your mother. She's known for years that the boy who built robots in the garage didn't just vanish. She knows you're protecting her. She just doesn't know how to thank you without breaking the only life she knows how to live. The reception noise drifted through the terrace doors, music and laughter. The sounds of people celebrating a future they believed was secure. Inside, Richard was probably holding court, telling stories about his success, his family, his generous spirit. My mother was probably smiling beside him, her hand on his arm, her eyes scanning the room for threats to the performance. "Why now?" I asked. "Why tell me this at the wedding?" "Because Claire asked me to." Thomas turned back to the golf course, to the darkness where sprinklers hissed and insects sang. "Because she wanted you to know that someone sees you, that the invisibility you chose isn't permanent, that there's a world outside the one Richard built where your name means something other than disappointment, and because—" He paused, and his voice changed, became something more personal, more raw. "Because I watched my friend die believing he was a failure. I watched Richard destroy him and walk away richer, respected, untouchable. I don't want to watch another brilliant man disappear into the lie that he's not enough. Not when I have the power to stop it." I looked at the paper in my hand. The names, the dates. The evidence of a crime that had happened so long ago it might as well be history, except that history was still walking around in a tailored suit, still destroying people, still teaching his stepsons that the only safety was in becoming nothing. "I need time," I said. "You've had 10 years. Thomas didn't look at me. "How much more time do you need to become real again?" I didn't go back to the reception. I walked around the country club, past the parking lot where my Freightliner sat among BMWs and Mercedes, massive and out of place, the cab where I'd spent more nights than in any apartment. I climbed in and sat in the driver's seat, breathing the familiar smell of diesel and coffee and the leather conditioner I used on the steering wheel. The laptop was in the sleeper compartment. I retrieved it, opened it on the passenger seat, and started reading. Thomas's documents were thorough. Financial records showing Richard's company absorbing his partner's patents without compensation. Emails where Richard discussed managing the narrative after the partner's suicide. Insurance policies that paid out to Richard's company while the partner's family lost their house. It was a paper trail of systematic destruction, documented with the care of a man who'd spent 15 years waiting for justice. But it wasn't enough. Richard was careful. The documents showed moral bankruptcy, legal gray areas, but nothing that would definitively destroy his reputation in the way Thomas wanted. Nothing that would make the board of his company turn against him, that would make his social circle recoil, that would reduce him to the ordinary criminal he was. I needed more. I needed the thing Richard had taken from me, from my mother, from every person he'd ever diminished. I needed his own words, his own voice, his own confession. I thought about the house in Greenwich where I'd grown up, the home office where Richard conducted his private business on a phone he thought was secure, the safe behind the oil painting of his first yacht, where he kept documents he didn't trust to lawyers. The security system I'd learned to bypass at 16, when I needed to retrieve my mother's medication from a locked cabinet while Richard was away on business. I knew that house better than Richard did. I'd spent years mapping its weaknesses while he thought I was playing video games in the basement. I opened a browser and logged into a server in Estonia, one of several I'd established over the years for projects that needed anonymity. I started writing code, a small intrusion package, elegant and specific, designed to slip past the security system Richard had installed 3 years ago. The system was good, corporate grade, but I'd been studying its architecture since before it was installed, reading the manuals online, understanding its logic the way I understood all systems. Everything has a weakness. Everything has a door that someone forgot to lock. By 2 a.m., I had access. The house was empty. Richard and my mother were staying at a hotel near the country club, too drunk or tired to drive home. I activated the home office cameras first, watching the empty room with its leather chairs and mahogany desk, the painting of the yacht slightly crooked on the wall. Then I activated the microphone. Silence, at first. The hum of electronics, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then a sound I didn't expect. Footsteps. Soft. Hesitant. Someone moving through the house in darkness. I zoomed the camera, adjusted the angle. My mother. In a nightgown I didn't recognize, her hair down, her face stripped of the careful makeup she wore for Richard's world. She walked to the painting of the yacht, reached behind it, and opened the safe. I watched her remove a folder. Watched her sit in Richard's leather chair under the camera I now controlled, and read by the light of her phone. Her face changed as she read. Not shock, not surprise. Something harder. Recognition. The look of a woman who'd been waiting for confirmation of a suspicion she'd carried for years. She photographed the documents with her phone. Methodical, page by page. Then she returned them to the safe, closed it, restored the painting, and walked out of the office with the same hesitant footsteps. I sat in my truck, staring at the screen, feeling something crack open in my chest that had been sealed for a long time. My mother knew. She'd always known. She'd been collecting her own evidence, building her own case, waiting for her own moment. I thought about Thomas's 4 words. Son, you saved her. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe she'd been saving herself quietly, slowly, in the only ways available to a woman who'd spent decades learning that direct resistance was dangerous. Maybe we'd been saving each other, invisible to each other, invisible to Richard, 2 people in the same house building separate escapes from the same prison. I copied the photographs from her phone before she could delete them, a simple sync exploit, child's play, and added them to Thomas's files. Then I sat back and watched the sun come up over the golf course, painting the manicured grass in shades of gold and rose, and I started planning the rest. The article published 6 weeks later, in a business journal Richard read every morning with his coffee. It was anonymous, sourced from extensive financial records and personal communications, but it named names, dates, amounts. It detailed the destruction of the Hartford engineer, the stolen patents, the insurance fraud, the systematic erasure of a man's life for profit. It didn't mention Richard's treatment of his family. That was still my mother's story to tell, if she ever chose to tell it. But it was enough. Richard's company launched an internal investigation. His board placed him on administrative leave. His social invitations dried up like water in August. The country club suggested he take some time before attending events. My mother moved out, into an apartment in Stamford that I'd helped her find through the Delaware lawyer, the one who handled my patents and my anonymous donations. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Richard was too busy trying to save his empire to notice her absence until it was permanent. I was in Ohio when the article dropped, hauling electronics from Cleveland to Cincinnati, listening to the news on satellite radio while rain streaked the windshield. I pulled over at a rest stop, bought coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, and called Thomas Brennan. "Your mother sent me a letter," he said before I could speak. She thanked me for introducing her son to the light. She said she'd been waiting in the dark for a long time, and she was sorry it took someone else to show her the door was already open. "She's not sorry," I said. "She's careful. She learned that from the best. She wants to see you. Properly. Without the performance." "I know." I watched a family across the parking lot, Parents loading kids into a minivan, the ordinary choreography of love that didn't require strategy or invisibility. I'm going to let her. I'm going to try being visible for a while. See how it fits. It won't fit at first, Thomas said. You've spent a decade making yourself small. Your body will resist expansion. You'll want to retreat, to disappear, to become the truck driver again because it's safer than being Dr. Cole, than being Marcus, than being someone people can see and name and need. And if I do retreat, then you retreat, but you come back. That's the difference between hiding and surviving, Marcus. Hiding is permanent. Surviving is just resting between battles. I thought about Claire, who'd found my work in a journal and recognized something she couldn't explain, who'd told her father about a brilliant man hiding in plain sight, who'd asked him to whisper 4 words at a wedding because she understood that some doors only open from the outside. I hadn't spoken to her yet. Not really. I'd been too busy becoming visible, too raw, too uncertain what I would say to a woman who'd seen me before I was ready to be seen. Tell Claire, I started. Tell her yourself, Thomas interrupted, gentle but firm. I'm not your messenger. I'm just the man who opened a door. You have to walk through it. I finished my coffee. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sky lightening in the west. I started the engine, felt the familiar vibration of the Freightliner coming alive around me, and pulled back onto the interstate. The cab was still my home, still my refuge, but I'd added something to the sleeper compartment last week. A framed photograph, small, tucked where I could see it when I lay down. My mother, in her new apartment, standing by a window with light on her face, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. She looked like herself. She looked like the woman who'd opened a safe in darkness and taken what she needed to be free. I drove east, toward Connecticut, toward a family I was learning to rebuild in daylight, toward a woman who'd seen me when I was invisible and decided I was worth finding. The road was long, the cab was warm, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like I was disappearing.